Thanks everybody again for joining us. If you're just joining us and didn't come this morning, we're happy to have you. This panel is called Getting Millions to Learn: What Will It Take to Accelerate Progress on Meeting the Sustainable Development Goals? I'm Rebecca Winthrop, the Director of the Center for Universal Education, welcoming you all back. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce our moderator and our distinguished panel, Gene Sperling on the end. Yes, he was the former economic advisor in two administrations for President Obama recently and President Clinton, but most importantly here, he's the founder of the Center for Universal Education and the man who recruited me for my job, so I'm always heavily in debt to Gene, so I think we give him a round just for that. We've asked Gene to make some opening remarks, and he'll moderate a discussion with our wonderful panelists. We have next to Gene, Johannes Lin, who's a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings, and also has several other hats, including with a sister organization, R4D, down the street. Next to Johannes is Alex Zwane, the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Innovation Fund. And then let's see who we have. Jacob Harold, who's the President and CEO of GuideStar. And last but not least, at the end here, we have Vineet, who is the Director of Investments at Omidyar Network. And again, welcome all of you. And over to you, Gene.
Well, thank you very much. I am truly a scarce resource that should be scaled up because I am a man who founded something and was smart enough, and I ran the center. I didn't just found it; I ran it for 7 years. But I'm that man who is smart enough, who's a founder, who is smart enough to hire a woman to succeed him, who is 5 times better than I ever was. So you need to scale me up in that way. I'm going to make one other little note, just because I want to, and I have the floor, which is Rebecca and I recently wrote a book called What Works in Girls' Education, Evidence for the World's Best Investment. There's so many people that are cited in that book, but there's one person who's cited as much as anyone, and somehow, even though I've cited this person more than almost anybody, other than I'd never met her, which is Elizabeth King. And I'm just honored that I got a chance to meet her today. It's the first time. I'm going to, I had Rebecca include in the introduction. I was supposed to make remarks because I said, you got to say that, because if not, it looks like you're a bad moderator who's talking first. So I'm going to make a few comments. So first of all, I mean, this is another excellent production book by the Center for Universal Education. And as we're in the donor side in this conversation, we are also in the part of the conversation where we are talking about funding and financing. And of course, the report talks about the importance of long-term and predictable financing. It talks about the importance of flexible financing. It talks about the importance of the middle financing, the scaling up financing, and that not being the valley of death. And then there's also a lot of different recommendations given. So let me make a few opening remarks. First of all, our goal, everything we do, our goal is to do what we have to do to give more children, particularly born into often difficult or poor circumstances, the chance to have education, allow them to rise to whatever their potential in life is. That's our goal. That is a noble goal. Now, when we're thinking about financing, we should always be thinking about what is the best way to achieve that noble goal. That does not mean assuming that everybody who's involved in it is a perfect person with completely pure altruistic ideals, has no human flaws at all. Because people are people. And it doesn't mean they have flaws, but it means that people, donors, and governments have incentives and self-interest. And we need to, instead of pretending that those don't exist, we need to have strategies that work that way. I think one of the things I learned in the workplace very quickly was that people want credit for things they do. It doesn't make them a bad person. It's pretty normal. That's pretty normal human behavior. And yet in financing situations, we often have, funders should just, put money into anonymous pots and, all this stuff. Okay, well, that might be ideal human nature, but I'm not really concerned with that. I want to know what actually is going to work for people who have incentives and do want to get credit or do want to feel good about their individual contribution. How do we motivate them to fulfill this ultimate goal? So couple of thoughts then. One, I'm going to add one thing to the book. I thought that it did talk about the importance of long-term financing, but I think when you're talking about education, you've got to break out teacher salaries in your discussion, because I don't know that it's right to blur those two together, because you can have a program that is about teacher training or all sorts of other things, and you can still need long-term sustainable financing for that intervention or that policy to work. But we are all doing education, and across the world, teacher salaries make up 60 to 80%. So it's not like a little thing, it is the dominant cost, and it is a recurrent cost each and every year. So here's one thing I learned when I was in the US government and when I was involved in the Fast Track Initiative and working here, which is that not only that governments will not commit to hiring more teachers, unless they know it's stable. I sat there with ministers of education of countries and said, but geez, the World Bank or the US government, we're willing to give you, 3, 4, 5 years of funding that you could use to hire more teachers. And the response I would hear, it's amazing, in different countries, different languages, but the same thing is, yeah, but when that money runs out, they're going to be outside my door burning me in effigy, not the donor who cut off the funding. So I think it's a very important issue, and we have to think about this. And I think my conclusion, but I'm open to this, is that generally we have to figure out a way to rally more support for funding teacher salaries, that it is very hard for outside donors to fill that role, both because of the magnitude of the cost and the fact that if it has any endpoint, it means layoffs, it means protest. And the person who is doing that, whether it's the school superintendent, the deputy minister of education, whoever it is, they are going to get the blame, and that's going to affect their behavior. So I think that is I think that's an important point that we should build in as we're thinking about different financing. Now, then the next point is, I looked at in the Millions Learning Report, there's like 14 different, you guys use 14 twice, which is very clever. 14 case studies, 14 things you should learn. But I think, now at the National Economic Council, we don't do 14. But you have to have 5. You can't go over 5. Presidents do not read 14-point plans, got to be 5. So I'm going to try to narrow down. I think when you're talking about government funding, there's really 3 things that matter most. One, and these are from the report. So I'm picking 3 of the 14. One, do you have real champions inside and outside who matter? Let me tell you one thing about the United States government or policy in general. You don't get things done because everybody supports you. That's not how it works. You get things done because there's a couple of people who matter who will die for you. When we're fighting for something and we have 80%, and people have 80% are for it, and they're like wondering how it didn't make it into appropriation bill, like everybody was for it. But when you're talking to Harry Reid and it's appropriations bill, and he's got 2 senators, and this is their number 1 priority, it gets through. So you need champions, real champions on, we can't all have Bono, but on the outside, but you need champions who matter on the outside, and you need champions on the inside. So that's a good recommendation, that's strong. Second, does it align with the government's interest? Recurrent spending on teachers is a major budget cost. It's a huge budget cost. Do you think that's going to happen if it's not central to whoever that government's goals are? If they have decided that their top goals in their administration are something other than education, they're not going to go with you. You've got to figure out how to align that with their fundamental strategy for credit, for doing good for their administration. Otherwise, you're going to be making all the good arguments, and they've decided, building bridges is their only priority. Probably a good priority, but shouldn't be their only. And then the third, I think, is evidence. I do believe that marshaling the evidence to show that things work and give a high return. So I think on winning that recurrent battle, you need champions, you need evidence, and you need to figure out how to align it with the government's interest. And this is when I said, don't look for ideal human behavior, take human behavior as it is. Brazil, that was smart. There was Bolsa Escola. But then a new president came in. I've been part of new administrations. No new president wants to focus on, helping the previous president's top thing. But they changed it to Bolsa Familia. They added nutrition. But think about that. That's smart. They came up with something new that could make it an exciting new initiative for the next president. That is what I mean by taking human behavior as it is, not how you'd like it to be, and be smart about it and give them a way so that you're not going, wow, the greatest thing you could ever do is just, continue the policy of the person you just defeated in the election. I think, and I think on the individual donor level, I think it's interesting to think about that too. There's a little bit of degree where donors want to do stuff that's creative, innovative, and there's a little bit of us not wanting a lot of duplication. That's a tough one for me, because I've seen a lot of times where people seem to be duplicating, but they bring imagination, they bring extraordinary entrepreneurial energy to it, and they do great things even though they might be duplicating some. But again, too, I don't think just telling them it's all been done, there's nothing for you to do, here's just two good organizations, give them money anonymously and go home. So I think it's worth us thinking as well. You may have a great program, but maybe you can say, this is a phenomenal program, but it hasn't been done in this part of this country. If you did this in this part of this country, your organization would be using a proven model, but you could go to this part of the country and you could see that there's 200 schools that are amazing because of your philanthropy or because of what you've done. So I think that's another way, again, of thinking about this. And the last thing I'd just say is that, obviously right now, this is an issue that Rebecca and I have been working on for a long time, which is funding education and conflict. And one of the things I noticed from being in the government, and I, with Rebecca's help, wrote about this when she was still at the IRC, which is that I noticed everybody would talk about why, you want governments to do it. But I'd always think it's a disconnect, because this is not the discussion that goes on in the government. The discussion that goes on in the donor government is, we don't trust that government. We don't know what their baseline is. We don't know if the money we're giving is going to go to the incremental positive it's supposed to. And if it turns out to go to something sordid, that's the end of that person's career. That is probably the end of money going to that country. So I said there's a trust gap. Now, so if you want to get, if you want to get money to people in conflict, you got to understand a donor government has real, reasonable risk that they are going to screw it up, that money is going to be misused. So you don't give up. You address those trust conflicts. You figure out architecture, transparency, separate funds, establishing baseline, and do those things. So those are my kind of initial thoughts in reading this excellent report, and from a perspective of someone who's had to be an advocate, but also be on the government side. So with that, I'm going to start going down the list here and hearing from our excellent panel, and we'll give them a chance to talk, and then maybe I'll have a chance to quiz them a little, but if we run out of time, I will save it for everybody here. So you've been warned in advance. You're going first.
Right. So thank you, Gene, and congratulations to the team for a great report. So truth in packaging, I'm supposed to talk about, do funders hinder or help scaling up? I've spent 30 years at the World Bank, and I've spent the last 12 years working mostly with funders, trying to get them to help a bit more in terms of thinking about scaling up and how to do it more or less right, taking into consideration human frailty and what have you. So bear that in mind as you listen to when I try to answer this question, do funders help or hinder scaling up? The answer is actually both in my experience. They can and do help, but they also get in the way, unfortunately. So what's the kind of role they should be playing? They should be playing the role of helping startups fund and support. But also, very importantly, they can be very good transmission belts, meaning taking ideas from one place to another, taking early startups and supporting them through the scaling up process. So there are terrific opportunities for funders if that's what they want to do, as I think they should. And indeed, we have some really wonderful examples where funders have been helpful at both stages or in both ways. Let me just mention the International Fund for Agricultural Development. You probably didn't know, but was early in supporting the Grameen Bank. So, that's a perfect example of startup supporting startup that scaled up. Another one is DFID supported the British aid agency M-Pesa, the famous Kenyan cell phone payment system. DFID was up there at the beginning. In terms of more transmission belt during the scaling up process, there are lots of good examples. The World Bank, the River Blindness Program in Western Africa, the Green Revolution was very much donor supported. MDB support, Multilateral Development Bank support for the cash transfer, conditional cash transfer programs like the Bolsa in Brazil, but also then taking that example and helping implement scale up in many different countries. You can go on. The Global Fund for AIDS, TB, Malaria is a terrific example. In the education field, we in Brookings published a book a couple of years ago about scaling up, and JICA put forward a great example of scaling up institutional reform for education, better education in Niger. Great example of scaling up supported by an aid organization. So there are lots of great examples of effective scaling up supported by donor organization. However, and this is sort of the truth now, inside the packaging perhaps, donors also have hindered. And I talk to some extent from personal experience, as you'll see in a minute. But why? Well, it's because they're fragmented. There is duplication. Duplication is okay if we use it effectively, if we learn from each other what we're doing and then scale up the things that work. But very often duplication is just that. It's duplication. And importantly, is combined with discontinuity. In other words, we go in for 2 or 3 years, sometimes 5 years, and we step out, we exit, we leave behind exactly as you say, the unpaid teachers in some cases, in other cases, just whatever we built, in a sense, collapses over a not so long time because we have not figured out a way to effectively hand off to others, mostly within the country. The average length of projects, aid-supported projects, is only 2 or 3 years. The median size of OECD DAC projects, when we last looked at this, is less than $100,000. Median, that means half the projects listed by the OECD DAC as officially supported projects funded by donors are less than 100,000. So just imagine how many projects are out there, and that's the reality. How many projects are out there that are one-off, that are relatively small, that are on their own, not linking up with partners and so on, and basically what I call pilots to nowhere. We all love to pilot, but we don't love to then follow up. So that has been, I think, a major problem. I myself remember very well when I was Vice President for World Bank for Europe and Central Asia, Jim Wolfenson, who is indeed, for me, sort of the godfather of the scaling up idea, in my case anyway. He was out in Georgia with us, and we had a great project to help about 15,000 farmers with a rural credit project. And he said, that's a great project, Johannes, but what are you doing when this project is over? What about the other 100,000 or what are farmers? Jim, sorry, we're already moving on to another project. That's not part of our program. Well, he was right. He should have asked this question. He was wrong because he didn't actually make us go back and redo our program. But in a way, that's it. So what happens when the project is finished, and what do we do from here? The duplication example. So I was just in Tajikistan a few weeks ago, and the Global Fund and UNDP had worked for about 10 years on HIV/AIDS program and had done actually a very good job. Well, guess what? Just as I was there, I was told that USAID, and I have to mention it, showed up and does basically a parallel program without cooperating, without coordinating with the Global Fund. And I thought, this is just outrageous. How can we do that today? So just an example that duplication can be helpful. But in this case, instead of figuring out exactly, say, what part of the city, what part of the country should we go to complement and scale up, they were actually, as far as I know, duplicating basically the capital city again. So just sort of examples of where we still, unfortunately, get things wrong. The bottom line is that donors still too often actually are, rather than supporting, or let me put it this way, rather than countervailing the fragmentation discontinuities that local institutions and local politics tend to, as part of local politics, just like in this country. Instead of being countervailing forces, they actually very often reinforce the fragmentation and discontinuities. So the good news, after all this bad news, sort of taking you back up, is that things are changing. So I've worked with something like 10 bilateral, multilateral donors and also civil society organizations over the last 10, 12 years on the scaling up agenda. And I've noticed a huge shift. Almost every organization now talks about scaling up where they never used to. And that is terrific news. The big challenge now is to actually make it work and figure out how, in this black box of the organizations, how do we change the incentives? How do we change the policies, the processes, the instruments in some cases? How do we change within the organizations, this black box of organizations, to actually get to where Jean wants us to be, namely aligned with governments, focused on on the exit question, what happens when we walk out because the project has come to an end, and these kinds of essential questions of scaling up. So this is the question what I think actually, now I come to very briefly to the report here, that the report is very helpful on, because it provides, in the area of education, it provides terrific experience that is being collected. It provides a good analytical framework, which we need to understand. Now, Jean said 14 is too much. I actually think 14 not for you convincing a president,
Yes,
but 14 as a checklist. Have we actually thought about the range of issues that might crop up? That is actually a very good checklist. And so I like the 14, and I hope, and I'm really actually not only hope, I'm very proud that the team is now already talking about where do we go from here. And so I wish you very well with the next step, because the last thing you want to happen is this terrific piece of work now sitting on a shelf and not being part of a scaling up process of scaling up education for all. This really is where now your big challenge is. How do you become part of a scaling up process in the education field? Thank you.
yes, and I should make clear, when I was doing the 14 and 5, I was making fun of us in the government for not being able to do that, not the report. We're actually usually only allowed to have 5 words for a message, but Vineet, I'm going to go to you right now. I have areas I'd like to push you in, but I'm going to let you just go free for now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So thank you very much for in asking us to join this. When reading and then just listening, we actually recognized a lot of what we're trying to summarize, and that's just based on our own practices. So I'm really here just to share. I think Rebecca and Jenny said, look, just come and share. So we don't come from the perspective of saying, well, this is the right way to do it. There is no right way to do it. That's one of the learnings that we've sort of done. But there were many aspects of what Jenny described and summarized in that report, which we've learned and recognized. So this is not in any particular order, and I suspect some of them will come back in some of the questions. So I'm going to pick 2 to start with. So one is this idea of core. So we really do recognize that. To the point that you were making, can funders help or hinder? Yes, the answer is both. And it comes down to what's the approach that they're taking. Now, at Omidyar, we typically are working at a very early stage in the life cycle of an organization. So we're not your classic scale-up programmatic funders. We don't use log frames. I mean, I personally wouldn't know a log frame if it hit me over the head with it, right? Now, the reason for that is if you're working early in the life cycle of an organization, it's kind of, I think a Prussian general said 100 years ago, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? Mike Tyson said it much more succinctly. Everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the face, right? When you're working early in the life cycle of an organization, nothing works the way you think it's going to work. So if you go in with this is what we are buying, and I have heard other funders sort of say, this is what we're buying. If you go in with that approach and say, this is what must be done, these are the outcomes, this is what must be tracked, you're really just setting up a rod for your own back and for the organization that you are working with. The approach we tend to take is, so we think of it as we're really injecting core support into an organization. And that's not just financial. So for us, it's a lot of time and effort is spent around the human capital side. So this is some of the points around activating the talent. When you're an early organization working with an unproven innovative idea, which is when we typically get involved, you will be having to deal with a lot of different things. There's the execution, there's the growth, there's the scale up. There's organizations in the room who've done this tremendously well. We've learned from that's a kind of non-financial support that is really important. So that's one area that we try and sort of provide and help. The second angle is the innovation side. So again, because we're not programmatic funders, we actually have a very high risk appetite. Our board has deliberately positioned us to say, where can we be most additive? And we can be most additive by taking risks that other funders, maybe quite legitimately because they're looking after taxpayers' money, may say it's too risky for us. That's where we try and position ourselves. And going to the point that's been made around government incentives. So what we try and do is to say, look, most people recognize that there is a problem, vast number of problems. And there are some reformers who really want to try and change things. And so in those circumstances, where there are those champions, where there are those key people, we will say, fine, we'll take the risk appetite. If it doesn't work, it's our risk capital that didn't work. If it does work, you're going to look like heroes. And again, that's something that we're doing, for example, in South Africa, in early childhood education, where, and I'll pause there because I suspect there may be lots of questions. I don't know if that's given you enough initial hooks.
No, that's very good. Well, I'll come back. Okay. Thank you. Alex, do you want to go next?
Sure.
And maybe explain.
Sentences on what Global Innovation Fund is.
Yeah, because that's not obvious to most people.
So the Global Innovation Fund is a nonprofit social investment fund set up about 2 years ago now by USAID, DFID, Omidyar, and the governments of Sweden and Australia. And our mission is to really accelerate the path to scale for entrepreneurs, whether they be in the social sector or nonprofit or private sector, and their path to scaling up their evidence-based innovations. We are a nonprofit, but we really seek to take a venture capital-like approach to the investments that we do. And because we are outside of government, we are able to mirror somewhat the appetite for risk that Vineet was describing as something that Omidyar aspires to. And I could talk a little bit about what we've done in education, and maybe that'll come up in some of the questions. I wanted to draw on in my comments here a little bit about my experience as a funder at a strategy-based organization that does do some of the what are we buying kind of work, where I was previously at the Gates Foundation, and talk a little bit about how that can help or not help. And I've also sat on the other side of the table and run a nonprofit trying to raise money and articulate a healthy relationship between myself as the grantee and the people on the other side with the checkbook who are the funder. One thing I think that this book really gets right and that I really applaud is this vision of investing in the middle phase. You know, pilots never fail and never scale. And you know, we are littered with pilot programs in whether we're in the education sector or health and other poverty reduction things. The great ideas that academics and early stage visionaries come up with that contain a seed of something fantastic really need to have a business model that's significantly de-risked before large institutions, whether that's an education system in a country or a big donor, can deal with them. It's very hard to innovate in a large organization. It's very hard to take risk. It's hard to ask any individual civil servant to take the risk of trying out an unproven program. And that's where philanthropic capital and donor capital can play a very interesting role, is being willing to de-risk a business model so that by the time you are pitching to the primary health or primary education department that they take something on, they understand, I know how to do this. I've seen how it works. My people can handle this. This is in our ability. I have the MIS system, or you'll help me build the MIS system we need to do this, so that it's de-risked. I think far too often donors want things to be ready for prime time too fast, and we need to really give ourselves the permission to fund through that middle phase of de-risking so that risk-averse agencies and entities can take things on. The other thing donors can do to help their nonprofit partners, I don't know if this is emphasized so much in the book, but it's implicit, is to think about exit. What is your exit strategy as a nonprofit working in this space? And scale it, and now this could sound a little bit contradictory with the point about scale, because I was just said fund the business model, de-risk it, which does mean grow, be tolerant of letting a program grow beyond pilot. But that plan for exit needs to be baked into the DNA of thinking about what the program is doing. It's the rare nonprofit where the long-term strategy is, I will provide these services at very large, interesting scale for a very long time. And so the donor can actually really do a favor of pushing that thinking on exit from the beginning. My next thing I might note that we might want to talk about, and I think this goes to some of the comments that you were making before and that you were making about supporting experimentation and supporting reformers and being willing to iterate. When I was at the Gates Foundation, we gave a large grant to, I don't think they'll care if I say it, CARE, who were running an complicated randomized controlled trial of this school wash program in Western Kenya. And they got really excited about, and we at the Gates Foundation got really excited about, great new school wash model. And frankly, we're out in international community talking it all up. Lo and behold, both CARE and the foundation had been so disconnected from what was going on within the Kenyan government that we were kind of blindsided by, the announcement by the Kenyan Ministry of Education that they were rolling out a new national school wash program, completely uninformed by this RCT that we had been funding. Matters were complicated still further by the fact that, frankly, the results of this RCT were messy at best and, a solid no at worst. But what CARE was able to do was pivot really nicely, get engaged, and saw that, in fact, this school wash program was going to require schools themselves to do a really good job of predicting their needs in terms of supplies, soap and toilet paper, et cetera, and budgeting for that stuff, and rolling that budget request up through zonal officers, district officers, et cetera, that would go finally up to I think this was before devolution, so to the province level. And CARE realized that's going to be really hard to do. Lots of these school principals don't know how to do that exercise, and the zonal education officers have never had to do the monitoring that will be needed for this program to work well. And so CARE pivoted and said, you know what we want to do? We want to help these schools learn how to write good budgets for this stuff, and we want to help those zonal officers do this monitoring. And change their program, were able to pivot and make themselves a useful partner to the Kenyan government school WASH program. Was that the most evidence-based WASH strategy ever that the Kenyan government wanted to do? I don't know, probably not. But it's what came out of their political process. And the donor and the international NGO were able to pivot and figure out a way to help that thing do well. I think that's a great story. I wish the story started with that idea instead of with the RCT that no one reads and no one cares about and probably costs more money than any of us would like to admit. But it's a good example of being willing to stick with and encourage that experimentation. I will argue back a little bit against paying for outcomes. I think sometimes that's good donor behavior because you don't second guess and get in the weeds with the partner around how they should achieve their goals. See if the goals that they want are goals that you want, yes, to buy, and the price is a good one, let them iterate and figure out how to get to that place. So I do think there's a role for paying for outcomes when you're thinking about how to have the donor play the right role in a situation where inevitably there's a power imbalance. But we can continue that conversation in plenary.
Thank you. Jacob, floor is yours.
Thank you. You know, I was thinking, I think there's a chance that I know less about education policy and innovation than anyone else in this room. But I have spent the last 10 years thinking about philanthropic decision-making, the flow of information, and how we might build a social change apparatus that's actually capable of tackling the great challenges of our time, including education. So I'll offer a few thoughts from that experience which may be relevant or useful in this conversation about education. So the first one is just a reminder that the social contract is in flux right now. We as humanity, I think, are struggling with what are the roles and rights and responsibilities of different elements of our society. That shows up often in language. So for example, we've been talking about donors and funders, but what do we mean by that word? And actually over the last day, I've heard that mean individuals, foundations, companies, bilateral donors, multilateral donors. These are profoundly different kinds of institutions. And on the recipient side, it similarly might mean a government department, a nonprofit organization, a social enterprise. And so there's a lot of, there's messiness in that. So let's step back for a bit and think about what I would argue is sort of the three pillars of society: government, business, and the nonprofit sector, setting aside some of the cultural pillars like religion. And let's think about what are those? So government is public action with the goal of public good. Business is private action with a goal of private good. And civil society is private action with a goal of public good, right? We don't want to have any public action with a goal of private good, right? And so within that, I think we need to step back a bit and be a little clearer about some of our terms. And then, this gets onto my second point, to really start to be thoughtful in a new way about the fundamental economics of social change. Because I think we're stuck in some old paradigms. And I think the middle phase argument is exactly the right sort of thinking that we need to have to begin to recognize that the economics of a given entity, whether it is a nonprofit or an arm of government or a business, those economics are going to evolve over time. They're going to require different kinds of financing at different points. And our challenge is to map the diversity of different sources of financing to those different stages over time, and to be very thoughtful about some fundamental dynamics that I think we sometimes ignore around, for example, the need for general operating support. And the fact that in many cases we are operating in the context of a market failure. And too often I think we will hear the argument of, well, why haven't you reached sustainability yet? And even the word sustainability has many, many different definitions. Are we talking about sustainability of just your core operating costs, or operating costs plus R&D and growth? And are we talking about sustainability based solely on earned income or on all sources of income? And I would argue that we should be defining sustainability as the ability to operate, to do R&D and grow, but based on earned income as well as other sources, as long as they are predictable. So again, I think there's an opportunity for us to just be much more thoughtful about the underlying arithmetic that makes up the economics of social change. And it can just be arithmetic. We don't have to get into multivariable calculus here. It's pretty basic addition and multiplication that actually drives whether these different entities, whether they're a nonprofit or a business or a government agency, actually is able to make the numbers add up. Thirdly, I'll just talk a little bit about data, and then let's move on to the discussion. We talk a lot about data in social change as well, and again, I think we aren't quite precise enough in some of our definitions. So let me suggest that there are 4 units of analysis or kinds of data that are relevant for these sorts of discussions. I've heard all of them brought up over the last few hours. So the first is data about the issue itself. So literacy rate in a given country, for example, would be issue-level data. The second kind of data is data about interventions, what actually works to address a given issue. The third category is the data that GuideStar has, where the unit of analysis is the organization. Now, ours is information about nonprofits, but you could apply that same sort of metaphor with information about businesses or government entities. And I'll just pause there and say, just in the US, there are 2 million nonprofits, 30 million businesses, and 76,000 government entities. We're really talking about organizations here, not government as one big blob or business as one big blob, but as these individual entities. And then fourthly, information about resources, whether that's philanthropic capital flows or other kinds. And we have historically kept those 4 types of information in silos, when in fact the real value comes when we cross-reference them. And that's when we begin to see, oh look, funding in this given country is all going to early childhood, or it's all on research, or there's this other kind of imbalance. But the thing, I'm highlighting here, I think, a lot of confusion in some of our language, in some of our conceptual frameworks. But I also think these are solvable problems, that we can get to the level of precision that we need about language, about intellectual frameworks, about analytical frameworks, about categorizations, and also that the technology necessary to organize this information in a way that would be useful absolutely exists. It is simply a question of political will, willingness to admit that we're not all unique snowflakes, that we can actually share our stories within common templates, that we can adopt data standards that allow for the easy transfer of data from one database to another. So I believe that 10 years from now, technology is going to enable us to be having a very different kind of conversation, and one that will allow us to address some, although not all, of the challenges that we face in funding the scaling of effective interventions in education.
So I'm probably going to have a chance to do 1 or 2 follow-ups before, but I'll start with you, which is one of the things I know you've been thinking about more is the overhead issue. Mm-hmm. I have always thought about this in various different contexts, and it occurred to me that overhead is probably more like cholesterol. There's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol.
That's right.
And, there's good overhead.
You like that, huh?
So, a lot of times we say to people, you need to have the lowest, you say to university, you say to a place, you need the lowest overhead possible. By the way, you need to have, different types of training to make sure there's, it's a friendly workplace, there's not sex harassment. We need quality measures, monitoring. There needs to be special guidance for people who are with disabilities or have difficulties. But please keep but we're going to judge you by how low your overhead costs are. Now on the other hand, we all know that governments and organizations often do have more staff than they need, more bureaucracy than they need. So help us. How should somebody be looking at this, particularly often when you're given something and it gives like just a number, and it's, you know, you're supposed to kind of assume it's a great thing. The lower that number is. How should people be thinking about? Because in education, I think the examples I just gave are very real to a lot of organizations, not just doing development work, but you know, your local school board would probably feel that way.
So don't get me started, but you got me started.
Okay.
You know, my predecessor, Bob Ottenhoff, liked to say, you wouldn't tell an airline that they should be minimizing the amount of money they're spending on maintenance. And in a sense, that's what we are telling the social change apparatus to do. And it is deeply, deeply problematic. That doesn't mean that an airline might not be inefficient in its maintenance and that that's something you shouldn't address. To me, a lot of this has been like the drunk looking for his keys under the light post. When asked, he says, well, I'm looking for it here, not because I think I lost it here, because that's where the light is. And in the nonprofit sector, the light has been around finances and not around programmatic metrics. And so we have fallen into, out of a good place, out of a desire on the part of donors to try and make good decisions with their money, we've fallen into a deeply problematic and counterproductive cycle of starvation where we are preventing nonprofits from making the investments they need to make to be able to train their staff, measure their results, et cetera. So my organization and a few others have launched a campaign called the Overhead Myth to try to restructure this conversation. And it's going to take a long time, partly because nonprofits, probably some represented in this room, keep training donors that overhead is what matters. So if you have those cursed pie charts in your fundraising materials, step one is to take them off. But you've got to replace them with something meaningful, and that gets back to the broader conversation about data, that we have to be willing to share an alternative. It's not fair to donors to say, well, I'm not going to give you this data point, but you don't get anything else. We at GuideStar are about to launch next month the first ever US-wide, it's not yet global, mechanism for collecting structured, quantitative, programmatic data about nonprofits, that is metrics about results. Again, the technology exists, it's just a question of designing, building it, and then getting the political will. So I think we can get there, and there are responsibilities for all of us in this room. As nonprofits, to be willing to share information. As donors, to pay attention, again, to the actual economics of the organizations. As if there are any journalists in the room, to stop writing dumb articles that are just about overhead and actually ask the much harder question of, is this organization actually creating any good in the world? Because that's the question that matters. And that's the question we need to be having as a field.
In the United States, if you're a U.S. federal government employee, you're given a chance to pick out a number of charities that you like, and you check them, and and usually wherever you are in the government, that group tries to meet its goal, et cetera. So you look through this list. There is one metric, just one, and that's your overhead cost. That is, and you look down, and that is the one metric. And so not just big donors, but millions of smaller donors are encouraged to look at that exclusively. Vineet, there's, sometimes you get an idea that there's a lot of excitement about, but it's not always as well defined, or people use a phrase, and then if you ask, you'll find 5 different people think it means something different. So social impact bonds. Are we just is this paying for results? Is this, there's no doubt huge positives here and lots of support. But on the other hand, a lot of times people use the phrase, people don't know what it actually means and refers to. And I think there's always the issue of feels good in the upside. How does it actually work in the downside? What does failing look like? How does a nonprofit fail? Are there really investors who would really seek returns from these? So just, I guess just asking in whichever of those you'd like to address, to go just a little deeper at how we should be looking at the kind of social impact bond, paying for results, both in success and when it doesn't work.
Great question. I think, like many phrases, it's used in so many different ways. So I'll try and
No,
sort of narrow it to what I think is probably the most interesting way to think about it. And this is, I know, a point that Ronnie Cohen was making at another event that I think Brookings had gathered together, which is really, it's about, if you reframe it and say, okay, we'll pay for outcomes.
Right.
And there's this whole question of how do you value those outcomes, and that's a separate process. But if it's done in that way, and if it's used to encourage, to incentivize, to create a space for people to experiment with things that they don't know may or may not work, that's actually really interesting.
Right.
Right? So, I mean, if you, as a dry economist, if you sort of step back and say, if you know something works, why would you outsource it, right? Normally, the cheapest cost of capital is the government's cost of capital. So it's kind of like vaccination. If you know vaccination works, why would you bake in a profit margin for someone to vaccinate? You know it works. What if it's something that's much more complicated, or where you don't know whether something would work or not, right? Who should take that risk? And historically, people said, okay, where you can build market-based models, great. But if you're trying to deal with the poorest quintiles, maybe whose ability to pay isn't great, that's when philanthropy would come in. Okay, when philanthropy comes in, people will say, well, okay, tell me what you're going to do. Tell me exactly what you're going to do so that I know what it is my grant is being used for. And that, what we found, ends up creating almost sort of binding constraints for the underlying organizations. Said, I have to report to the donors about what I'm doing this. Every year I'm going to raise going on a sort of fundraising cycle. Whereas, and so this goes to the point that Alex was also saying, now talking to some of the organizations that have pioneered it, they said, the minute we were able to raise this capital, it's effectively medium-term risk capital. Because someone said, as long as you deliver these results, this is the cash. You have to go and find the investors who will take that risk. And I know that was one of the questions, and we can come to that. But from the organizations, from the innovators, from the entrepreneurs' perspective, they said, as long as I can get that upfront risk capital, someone who buys into my ability as an organization to execute what a normal investor would do, this kind of analysis when you choose which company to buy a stock in or buy a bond in, you're kind of making that judgment call. Then there's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years worth of free space, so that as the executing organization is saying, actually we're finding a different challenge here, we need to change what we do, it makes them much more data-led. So you're talking to one of the entrepreneurs who is involved in India on this. They said the minute that they did this, they found themselves changing how they worked as an organization, what they focused on. Data becomes super important, right? That's what any decent startup will do, right? You have to know if your product is working, if your customer likes what you're doing, right? And that's what it makes those organizations much more necessarily sensitive to data. Is it working? Are people coming through the door? Are outcomes going up or not? It also changes the mix in who are they accountable to. Are they trying to please the donor? Or are they saying, actually, to please the donor, to please our investors, we have to deliver these outcomes. So they start to really focus much more on data capture, data analysis, course correcting early when it needs to. And again, at all times, they have the ability to do that. They don't have to suddenly say, well, we said to our grant givers, this is what we would do. Now we're going to be doing something different. Now do we need to go and get their permission? They don't need to do that. The big question is, what's the path to scale in this, and how are these things used? And I think there, people are figuring things out. One way of looking at it is, if you find something, an innovation that works, and said, yes, we now know it works, maybe the best way to industrialize it is within the existing system, right? Or maybe it's with lower cost capital. It's become de-risked. Those will be very, very different things. And I think it'll be case specific. To your question of what constitutes failure.
Well, let me ask you another thing too, because this is what can be a little confusing sometimes, which is who bears the failure. So if you have a social impact bond, pay for results, and its local bank here says, come invest in us. We're going to build low-income housing better than anybody else. And if we do, you, the government, are going to pay us. And if you don't, you think, well, it's okay. It's a for-profit. They took some risk. If they don't get paid, that's okay. You don't think of telling a Head Start organization that they'll like do something innovative on preschool, and if it doesn't work out, they just go out of business, et cetera. So explain in your model who is the, because what you're describing here often sounds like, to use old language, what you would have called like giving somebody a waiver to not live by certain rules as long as they produce certain results. They have flexibility if they can guarantee a certain amount of results. And you also kind of understand that you give people an innovation grant, and if it doesn't work well, they may not get the next round. But it's often hard to understand when you're dealing with nonprofits and others, how is it structured so that the person taking the loss, in that case, is someone you would be willing to let take a loss?
Transactions, I'm not going to claim to be the definitive expert because a lot of people are using different structuring techniques. But to your specific the question, the financial risk ought to be taken by the upfront investor, the organization who bought the bond or the capital instrument. They're the ones taking the financial risk. So if it doesn't work,
right,
and the outcome pair, the government said, I'm not paying, you didn't deliver the results, that financial risk is taken by an investor who said, okay, fine, that's the calculated risk I took. The reputational risk is probably for the underlying organization,
right.
But the financial risk should sit with the investors.
But the execution risk is with the implementing organization. They need to have confidence in their business model that they know how to do the activities they're committing to do at a certain cost.
Exactly. And that's parallels, like when you buy shares in a company, you're not going to go and tell the management, I'm going to tell you what to do. You're sort of saying, I'm buying shares in a company, I'm taking your execution risk, right? And it's essentially the same thing. People will do a lot of their diligence. They say, is this a good organization, right? Whether it's for-profit or non-profit, it doesn't really matter. It says, can this organization do what they say they can do? And if I think that their execution risk is good enough, am I willing to put my risk capital up to do that? And now the UK has sort of been a little bit ahead of the other parts of the world. It seems to be working. In the UK, there are transactions, a lot of transactions, where payouts have been triggered. Now, if we pause and think, what that means is outcomes have been independently, objectively measured, where it said, yep, this social value has been created, it has outperformed a benchmark, money has been paid for something that was sensible for the payer, and the investors are taking a return. Then that's been bundled up into a fund, and actually now pension funds are coming into that. There's a lot of risk. So the first people who took the risk of buying those instruments are taking a huge risk because you're pricing a lot of unknown things. And that's where it goes to this, some of them are philanthropically motivated. They're the ones willing to take the de-risking. So we were part of the first Impact Bond Fund in the UK. We said, it's an experiment because we want to see if you can create a wholesale vehicle. Validation there is pension funds saying, actually, this thing is working.
No, the only point I would add, there's another risk, and this is the risk to, let's call them social service beneficiaries. So, your experiment fails, but kids aren't being educated at the end of it. So, it's the same problem that the official donors face, or maybe haven't faced up to enough, is, we talk about learning and so on by making mistakes and so on, and we move on to the next project. But somehow or other, there is, in the political context, there's perhaps accountability because the government, local government officials that supported the SIB doesn't get reelected because the SIB failed. But in the end, it is the children that, in a sense, bear the risk of not being well educated. So I still think we have to think when we do this outcome-based financing approaches, what happens if it fails? Just as we need to think what happens if it works. And your point about exit, I think, is absolutely critical. We need to think much harder about what happens at the end of the project, the end of the intervention. It may be exit, or maybe the next stage where we need to stay engaged in one form or another.
Okay, well, I had one more question, but I'm going to cede to this robust audience. All right, we'll start over there. Yes, you in the corner. But so identify who you are, and if you're with an organization, identify that organization too.
Actually, I'm Lucy from CamFed, and I just wanted to thank you for picking up on this issue of results-based financing, because I think that results-based financing in education, when it's attached to learning outcomes, is a very underdeveloped science at this point. And I think we all need to recognize the risks associated with that and the potential for perverse incentives to be built into this. And one risk that we've seen is the potential for hot housing cohorts of kids to get the learning outcomes, but at the expense of the system. So how do you triangulate
What
the
was the
incentives?
expression you used?
Hot housing.
Hot house.
Is that like creaming? We would say, what is?
Intense intervention on particular groups of kids to
Yeah.
produce the learning outcomes that will result in the payment, whereas that might be at the risk of the system. So how do we align the incentives appropriately to ensure that this does result in long-term sustainable change? And I think that this is an important area, particularly as we look at the issue of scale, that we need to recognize there's a lot more work, a lot more ground to be covered in developing this.
And, truly that exists a degree, the incentive issue, or, it can exist even as we see with where it's just scores or et cetera. But, Rebecca, this is probably a whole day topic sometime. I know you don't have enough on your plate. Okay, I have to call Colleen or I'll get in trouble.
You would not get in trouble. Colleen Beauchesne from Their World and the Global Business Coalition for Education. I'm interested to know how, Jane, you've been around for a long time, and the panelists think about the direction we're heading in. So we're in a position right now where education financing is declining. It's nowhere worse than in the poorest countries. We're trying to start new initiatives to address things we should have addressed decades ago. We're in a really bad position globally for funding global education. Are we heading in the right direction? What are the things we're doing that are working?
Well, I do think that when you look at the examples of, I do think one of the tensions that we still all face is that a lot of our success stories are still kind of NGO success stories that kind of expanded. Now, sometimes it's Escuela Nueva where it becomes connected, et cetera. But I do think that one would like to see perhaps more examples where you can point to maybe not an entire national government, but what would be the equivalent in the United States of here's 5 states where the government itself has eventually taken and scaled up. I mentioned the recurring cost thing a lot, obviously, because the lesson of the last decade, obviously, was without the, this is where different contexts are. If you're in a place where you're perhaps spending an appropriate amount of money, you have the kids going to school, and you just have to improve quality, then you can maybe talk innovation, just efficiency. If you have 30% of your kids out of school, you're going to have to increase teacher salaries close to 30%. And if you don't, then you're going to have what none of us want, which is the quality access trade-off. So I think what's important, and I like in the report, is that it is talking about not just, that has examples not just of organizations that have scaled up, but I still think that I'd like to see a report 5 years from now where you had 14 examples and every single one was essentially perhaps a government example, not from scratch, but having learned from the different lessons of innovation and actually implemented. And I think that, I would say even when you're inside the government pushing for more development aid, the lack of that evidence is a hindrance. I don't know if anybody else want to comment on that.
Just one quick comment. You know, you talked when your opening remarks about champions and aligning with priorities.
Yeah.
And I think there's actually some really great case studies coming out of the interesting space where the randomistas or the people who want to experiment genuinely do bring their talents to bear on questions that governments want to answer. So one great example that's relevant to this crowd is a partnership with the Ministry of Health in Zambia, where they were really interested in how should we market joining up to become a nurse and a community health worker with us. Should we emphasize career constraints and career goals or public service? We really want to get a better crop of people. And they ran a super simple experiment of just different marketing messages. But it really spoke to a problem that they had, that they identified, and have changed a lot now. Some of their strategies around recruitment for community health workers, and they're doing this other stuff throughout the public service in Zambia. Simple, cheap, not a big infrastructure to ask an academically interesting question. If we can do things that help governments answer questions, that might be part of how we get to the vision you have.
On the finance question, you know, there's the macro finance issue. How do you increase local tax? And the fact that today taxes are a bad word in certain countries anyway doesn't help. But if you wish, at the micro level, specific programs in particular countries, what I've seen being really effective is that when you design programs, you implement them, you pilot with a vision for scale, and so you set up sort of this question, so where, if this works, what then? And you know that part of this, making it work at larger scale and sustaining it, is more government finance. Well, you better bring the Ministry of Finance into the process up front, not at the end. You then go with cap in hand and say, give us money, but you bring them, and some of the programs I've worked with actually do this, and I think that's one way. I mean, it's not, Minister of Finance is rarely going to be champions for a particular line item in the budget. But if they understand, because of the evidence in part that you've generated, this thing actually works at whatever scale then you bring them into the process, and it's more part of their own decision-making that they realize this is a program that works. It's a program that has champions, important champions out there, and we really ought to put it on a sustainable budget trajectory.
I'd still rather have it be part of the head of state's basic promise.
That too. Fair enough.
So.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Courtney Bennett, International Affairs, American Federation of Teachers. I'm happy that you guys are here and that we're having this conversation, a critical conversation in terms of scaling quality education. My question is, the panel mentioned something about the role of shareholders in terms of like public companies. Like, my question is, what is the role of the shareholder in terms of like companies that are investing in the arena of education, right? So does the shareholder have a say in the company and how they are funding certain organizations within global education? I can give an example if you need one.
Anybody want to take a shot?
I'm happy to, just general observation. I think what I'd say is it depends upon the shareholder. To reduce it to almost one extreme, every time someone buys a share in a company, right, the buyer is saying, I think this price is going to go down. I think this company is not going anywhere. The seller is thinking, I think this company is going to go up, right? So what I'm saying there is that different shareholders may have different incentives, may have different views, may have different motivations, right? So it's very difficult to give a universal answer to that. It goes to what Jean was saying, which is at the start, which is humans are humans. Different people, different humans have different incentives. So yes, out there, are there shareholders who would be the caricature of, only interested in profit? Probably. But does that mean all shareholders are like that? I would say no. That would be an unfair generalization the other way. And if you sort of step back, I think the question is more around the role of for-profit capital in education. And I think that is, the same question can be applied to the role of for-profit capital in health or in any kind of socially important service. It really comes down to what's the regulatory framework. If you have complete, I think only sort of market fundamentalists would say you can't have any regulation. It really comes down to what the regulatory framework is. What are the either minimum standards, or what is the role of the state in acting as the regulator and saying, okay, this school's not working, or that school is working. I think it's much more complex. It's also much more context specific. To some extent, these questions also touch upon the social contract, which will vary from country to country. So I don't think there's any generalizable answer.
I think you've hit another topic that could probably be the whole thing, and I think this is something where people probably have very strong views. I mean, I'm of the view that in education, the shareholder is the democracy, that the government, and that has to set all the incentives. Then you could have creativity in allowing people to help serve it, but I think the fundamental incentives have to be the will of a government elected by the people to make those, and not. And I think that is a little different from other things, but that's why the issue of private capital and private education is a controversial one, an emotional one. But it certainly has some intersection when you start looking at the kind of pay for success. And it's worth, again, thinking about how the incentives work and whether you can coordinate them with with what would be the goals of the people generally. But again, another great full day session that Rebecca should be doing sometime in the next 3 months. I mean, if she's.
Chris McRae, I'd like to go back to the proposition made in the morning, I think by Madhav, that maybe the whole system is broken. What if the macroeconomics governments of sort of industrial age is undervaluing youth and learning by tenfold? I mean, half the world is under 30. The sustainability goals, maybe they should be something that you should be in the middle of. Maybe we should map education backwards so that the sustainability goals actually happen so that youth can do them. If you extrapolated all of that, maybe learning is a 10 times larger economy than the macroeconomics is making the case for.
Well, again, I mean, I don't know if anybody wants to take a shot at it. I do think that thinking through how one looks at their education systems, particularly with the pace of change we have right now, the expression I've done a bit is that it's a little bit like trying to figure out, if somebody had to train for the Olympics, but they didn't know what sport they would be in. When I first came to the government in 1992, very, very smart people in our government predicted that one of the 5 fastest growing jobs would be travel agents. Now it was very intelligent because they were looking at travel behavior. They were looking at a larger retirement, middle-class retirement set. It was reasonable. You just missed that little thing. What was it? Oh, yeah, the internet. But that was as smart people as you could have. And so you are in a world where, education systems are going to have to figure out, they aren't going to have a map. They aren't going to have this precise map. And the expression I used in the training for the Olympics, if you didn't know what sport it was, you would have a certain amount of strength, a certain amount of quickness, a certain amount of flexibility for a sport you didn't know that was going to take. And I think it's, I think that's a larger issue that is as relevant today in the developed countries as the developing ones. Okay, we're doing a lot of discrimination towards the front rows here, but okay, sorry, I had to, in the interest of fairness and back row diversity, I had to.
Thank you very much. My name is Divya Kapoor, and I was curious if you could speak to a little more about public-private partnerships, if at all, in this space. I know we're talking about NGOs. It's been very interesting hearing all the interesting ideas that have come up, but I'm curious if there's anything that you have identified, a potential public partner and blended finance, if you could speak to anything that you think is scalable. Thank you.
If you mean from a financing perspective, a very interesting thing that we're noticing, my focus is mostly being based in London, so I sort of focus more on the Africa time zone. So in South Africa, there's some interesting things happening where the government for the renewable energy, where what it sort of said to companies said, if you want to be able to generate renewable energy and sell it into the grid, you have to reinvest X% of your... Yeah, no, that's where I'm going. I know, it sounds great, renewable energy, but what they said, you have to reinvest X% of your revenues into the local community and into specifically, for example, into education. So what is now happening is that these energy producers in South Africa are saying, okay, we've got cash, which we have to reinvest in education. What do we invest it in, right? And so this goes to one of the points that I think was mentioned yesterday as well. So you have private sector organizations saying, well, actually, I'm quite happy to do this, right? And so what they're doing in that particular example is they're saying actually they've identified early childhood education. So they're saying we will essentially pay for the cost. We will create digital vouchers that will go to the parents, so that they can use it in their early childhood, local early childhood centers. And that's what those companies are doing. Now, again, it's the role of the state there as well. The government said, if you want the license to generate this electricity, this is what you have to do, right? And the South African government has gone a little bit further still and sort of recently said that depending upon the size of the company, if you're a very big company, it's 6% of payroll costs. If you're a slightly smaller company, it's 3% of payroll costs has to be spent in skills development. Now, if you step back in your local neighborhoods, and most companies are saying in light and self-interest, I want to do this, right? Because if I can improve the supply of potential labor, if I can actually invest in my communities, and if they will earn more, they'll spend more, right? So these are some of the things that we're seeing. We're seeing banks. So now, if the private company is the buyer of this, right, they're approaching things in different ways. In some cases, they're saying, well, we just give the money through vouchers to the parents. Parents decide what they want. Other private companies are saying, actually, we want to look for, in that case, nonprofit operators, because these are companies that have to give it as grants. They're saying, we want to see the high-performing nonprofits. So come show us your efficacy. Come show us your cost effectiveness. Because I have to spend X, it's a purchase decision by a company. It's not a pet project for a CEO. It's 6% of their payroll costs. And so the question will be, how does that get scaled up? What is the corporate response to this, right? If they come at it and saying, well, let's just spend this money intelligently rather than as a PR exercise, you should be getting more capital, so a public-private sourcing of capital going into local organizations where people are saying, you better be delivering results, you better be cost-effective, all of those things.
I'll give you one or two examples in the United States that I think are quite interesting right now. They're a little bit the opposite of what I was saying. It's very difficult to imagine when you're teaching a 5-year-old what the economy is going to be, not so much with a 17-year-old. And right now you are seeing things like the IBM P-Tech program, where Some people want an advanced education but are motivated by something more tangible. A company or a group of companies working with the school district to do something where you maybe have a 6-year degree, or that degree leads to a very clear credential that is recognized. And let me say, this is something you can't do without the private sector. If you have and I'll tell you one place it's kind of happens is kind of in computer science. There are certain private sector little credentials, and they mean something. And if you have an assortment of them, it applies everywhere. So I do think the kind of partnership and credentialing of things that people can learn in their last years of high school that will have a tangible job connection is not something the private sector can do. The smartest public sector person in the world can't do that. You can only do that if you have a coordinated partnership. And I don't think that's an example that is just exclusive to a very advanced economy. I could even imagine that having lots of applications in countries that were still emerging or developing. Okay, it's your time. It's your turn.
Thank you. My name is Dima Bibi. I manage a nonprofit organization called Injaz in Jordan. So one of the prerequisites for an NGO to scale up is to build its institutional and financial sustainability. And one method of doing that is to build an endowment fund, grow and invest in it. And my question is, why do donors avoid that? We find it very hard for us to get donor funding going directly to an endowment fund. They always prefer to spend it on operations and programs, although it's much easier for us NGOs to find multiple donors, smaller donors, who can and would support programs. So that's...
So I have lots of thoughts on this. I personally find endowments to be very economically inefficient. And the reason is that I think that many of the issues that we're facing in the world have a high social discount rate. And what I mean by that is that spending money sooner is much better than spending it later. And I think that's not true for all issues. For the ballet, for example, has a very low social discount rate. A ballet now and a ballet in 50 years are both equally valuable. Investments around climate change, education, infectious diseases, I think there's a strong argument to spend money sooner. So personally, I'm not a big fan of endowments. However, especially those endowments that really lock the money into place. With a rare exception, like if you are trying to protect a particular place in perpetuity, an endowment starts to make sense to me. But I just generally think we should spend more money sooner. That's why I think the fact that in the United States, the 5% payout rate minimum has become a maximum, and that's a profound tragedy for social change. Foundations should be spending money according to the problems they're trying to solve, which might be much faster than 5%. However, I would also say that it is very important for donors to think about how do we make sure that nonprofits have sufficient liquidity and a balance sheet that actually allows them to make investments which may not pay off for a long time. So I guess my suggestion would be to not use the language of endowment, because I think that just sounds too delayed, you know? But instead to really talk about a balance sheet that provides the liquidity and the capital structure that allows you to make the investments you need to make impact now and later.
How much, you read a bit about like kind of hybrid models now where, or just the decisions by certain people have significant amount of wealth to essentially, die broke or, spend it down. But yet for an organization, are there models in between where it's like, we're not going to build an endowment in 5%, but there's a certain kind of capital not necessarily for capital, but the kind of campaign where at least somebody, the people who run organizations aren't spending 75% of their time fundraising?
Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, absolutely. And what that requires is one of the great challenges of all of strategy, which is articulating what you're going to do on different time horizons. And to say, look, for the next year, we're going to run a capital campaign that allows us to stop focusing on fundraising for 5 years, recognizing that 5 years from now, we're going to have to pause and reassess and really think about a next phase. And so yes, absolutely. But it's hard to do, and it takes some time.
My experience, I've been on both sides also, like you, in different ways of both funding and fundraising. And you have sort of a conflict of interest potentially between the organization, the management, who clearly wants to have core funding, preferably an endowment with which you can have predictable funding for a long time to come. And on the other hand, the donor, who actually wants to have control over how her or his money is being spent. And so you see that actually on a large scale in the World Bank. I mean, the World Bank has, in a sense, an endowment, which is the capital that the governments contribute. And to some extent, the governments feel, the donor, big donor governments in particular, they sort of lose control by having put that money in there. And then the bank management can, now they still have the executive directors, and the US happens to have a veto right over any big decisions, so there's a sense of control. But they actually, as donors, like what's called IDA, the International Development Association, much better, because that money has to put in every 3 years. And every 3 years, the donor can come back and say, oh, by the way, I don't like what you've been doing, I'd like you to do something different. And lo and behold, the organization has to react. So the question of control is very critical. Now, some wise donors may think, no, I don't want control, because actually I'd rather have a governance system and set up an institution that will survive me, and that where the governance system in itself is the control, and where the constitution of the organization is what gives me assurance that it'll do what I want to do. So for you as an NGO, you somehow have to find a way to convince your donor, number one, to put as much money in as possible into sort of at least a bit something like an endowment. Secondly, to core fund you, and so it isn't all earmarked to specific little projects. And then, yes, top it up where there's specific projects. And somehow, that's the trick. And I was on the receiving end of this, and it's tough. I mean, it's really tough to do it right. And so, good luck.
Well, that's right. I think,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
just quickly, the Global Innovation Fund's an interesting example of, DFID, USAID, they could and do actually have innovation units within those institutions. But there was still a felt need and a value add of having an independent entity that they funded, essentially, as you said, with core funding, with and predictable amount of money outside of government, but they exercise control through their board membership. And then it's good for them because the trade-off is less control, but an entity that can take more risks, do risk capital investments, things that is very difficult to do sitting within an agency like USAID.
So the Sperling Center for Universal Education might have gone on for another 5 or 10 minutes, but the Rebecca Winthrop, when it says the panel ends at 3, it ends exactly at 3. And so I know the next 3 questions were going to be amazing, but I have to live under this new regime. My congratulations to Jenny for this, as well as Rebecca and Eileen. And thank you so much, panel. I think we hit all the issues we were supposed to. No, we didn't resolve everyone, but we hit them all. So thank you.